And hello,
Hi.
and welcome to Hacks on Drac, a podcast miniseries examining the legacy of Bram Stoker's iconic vampire novel. I'm Matt,
I'm Chris.
and over the course of 10 episodes or so, we're going to be talking about the legacy, if you will, of Dracula in pop culture, and kind of where all of our sort of preconceived notions about Dracula come from, because I really wanted to do this podcast because I was thinking about that, like, Dracula is one of these things that kind of everybody knows about.
Absolutely.
Everybody's got a version of Dracula in their brain. If you tell someone to visualize Dracula, they have an image already formed.
Yeah. It's like Superman, Batman, God.
It's like Santa Claus.
Santa Claus, yeah.
It's just like he's almost like a mythical figure on like a higher plane. But Dracula itself isn't that old a book. It only came out in 1897, which is relatively not that long ago.
Which, when we were talking about that really surprised me. Even after reading it, I didn't... it seems like it's probably like 200 years old, and it's really not.
Everything about Dracula kind of has like an older kind of mythology behind it that kind of makes it seem like it's much grander and older than it is. And a lot of it stems from kind of old mythology as well, which helps that. But yeah, as a book, Dracula has only been around since 1897. You know, like The Great Gatsby came out in, like the early 20s, something like that. And that's considered a pretty modern novel. And there's only about like a 30-year difference between that and Dracula.
Yep.
Yet Dracula is kind of considered this,
It's an old-timey...
It's like an old-timey, spooky tale. And that's like an example of, like modern whatever. So we're just going to go through and kind of examine why Dracula is so prevalent in our minds and where, like I said, various kind of things about Dracula come from when we think of Dracula. Because if you tell a normal person to visualize what Dracula looks like in their head, that visualization is nothing like what's in the original book Dracula.
Yeah.
In any way, shape, or form.
It's similar in the way that you hear Frankenstein and everyone immediately thinks of the monster.
Yeah.
When that, in fact, is not the case. Which I always get a kick out of telling people. No, I don't. I'm not that guy.
Are you one of those people that, like, goes up to people and they say, like, that's Frankenstein, and go, actually, that's Frankenstein's monster?
No.
I have to say, like, I'm a pretty big horror person, but people like that, I'm like, get the fuck out of here.
It's like, you know what I was talking about. It's talking about Frankenstein.
It's like John Mulaney says, just because you're accurate doesn't mean you're interesting.
So, but yeah, no, it's true, because there's been so many adaptations of Dracula and interpretations of Dracula, and so if you ask anyone to picture Dracula, they might have a vastly different image in their head. Yeah,
depending on where they're from geographically. People in England view Dracula kind of differently based on the media they have over there versus how we view Dracula.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So over the course of, like I said, 9 or 10 episodes, we're going to go through various kind of famous adaptations of Dracula. Just the Dracula story, though. We're not going to get into any of the weird spin-offs and stuff until...
Sequels, prequels.
We're going to do on our last 2 episodes, the last 1 or 2 episodes, depending on how long the discussion is, we might chop it up. We're going to get into some of our favorite shitty Dracula sequels. Like, we might talk a little about Dracula 2000, which we watched together a couple weeks ago. And
oh my god, you know what, we did watch that entire movie.
We watched that. Are you already blocking it out of your brain?
It's just so forgettable. I completely forgot that we actually sat and watched that entire thing.
We did, but the rest of the podcast, we're gonna just go through and talk about, like I said, big adaptations of Dracula. Starting with our second episode, we're gonna talk about the original silent Nosferatu, and then the episode after that, we're gonna talk about the Bela Lugosi Dracula.
Yeah, so it's all the major film adaptations.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about the Christopher Lee one, the Frank Langella and Jack Palance one. We're going to do a tag team on because they're both kind of middle of the road kind of adaptations. I think that's interesting. The Herzog Nosferatu, the Francis Ford Coppola one, and Dracula Dead and Loving It by Mel Brooks. Yes. It's not an important one, but it's funny and I like it. And this is my podcast, so so that's the basic kind of structure of what we're going to be talking about over the course of this little mini series. Like I said, like everyone kind of has like it seems like you're almost just like born with knowledge of Dracula. Like asking someone what their first memory of Dracula is almost kind of, it's like asking someone what their first memory of Santa Claus is.
Yeah.
It's just like, it seems
can't.
like it's just so ingrained in the zeitgeist that like you kind of just like absorb it almost.
Yeah.
But as much as you can, what is your first recollection of Dracula?
So I'm pretty sure my first recollection was of identifying who Dracula was my brother, who's a couple years older than me, dressing up as Dracula for Halloween. And I think I was in kindergarten or preschool or something. But yeah, I mean, I remember we still have a picture of it actually. But yeah, he had like the widow's peak fangs. He had blood, and he was wearing like a cape. And I probably watched one of the earlier Dracula movies back then. I honestly don't remember the first one I watched, aside from seeing the Francis Ford Coppola version in the theater when I was like 9 or 10.
Oh, your parents took you to go see the R-rated Francis Ford Coppola? Oh, wow.
So my mom used to work weekends, so on the weekends my dad would just take me and my brother to go see movies and go to museums and stuff. But yeah, he didn't really care too much about ratings. I think as long as he was like watching it with us and could explain to us after what certain things meant, he was fine with it. So yeah, I remember seeing that movie, and because like what you said, like when you have that image of Dracula in your mind, even if you've probably never sat through an entire Dracula movie, I remember coming out of that movie and being like, oh, that was like a much different interpretation than I was expecting. So what's your first early memory of Dracula?
My first early memory of Dracula, like my family's pretty big horror people, just like in general, and but we didn't get to watch anything like scary when we were younger unless it was funny in some kind of way. So like a lot of my early memories of Dracula are from things like the Treehouse of Horror, the Simpsons one, when they go visit Mr. Burns.
Classic.
in Pennsylvania, and they kind of do like a quick Dracula ripoff with Mr. Burns. Mr. Burns looks like the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula with the white butt hair.
Yep.
And like the shadow that moves and everything. And
he has dentured fangs too, I believe, right?
I don't think Grandpa Simpson at the end of that episode has denture fangs.
Yeah.
Where he flies into the room to get Lisa, and then he like hits us.
Yeah, it's a great gag.
Those are so good. Those are a lot. Those are like some of my earliest horror anythings, like the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror ones.
I know. I looked so much forward to every Treehouse of Horror.
They're really good. To this day, like the Treehouse of Horrors are still like the only Simpsons episodes worth watching.
Right.
I feel like if they just canceled the Simpsons and said we're coming back like just once a year just to do the Halloweens, I'd be like, that's fine.
Eventually.
But other than
that was
like,
before you'd even seen the Coppola Dracula.
Oh yeah, I think eventually, like so after that, like my mom in particular, because she's huge into horror stuff, like started introducing us to like Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein, which that was probably my first seeing a live action Dracula.
Yeah.
Which that's a great movie. A lot of the Universal monster movies are kind of shit, and they're kind of like
Bela Lugosi's in that one.
Bela Lugosi is in that one. That's only one of 2 times that he played Dracula.
So weird.
In name, yeah. So a lot of that, and then eventually she showed us like the original Bela Lugosi Dracula, which as a child I was very bored by, and I think I fell asleep. This is how unmemorable the Bela Lugosi Dracula was to me as a kid. As I remember sitting down to watch it with my family, and then I like nodded off halfway through it because like most of that movie is just like boring people talking in chairs, and then like I woke up and an episode of I Love Lucy was just playing on TV Land. Like my parents like finished the movie, or just watching something else, and it took me like 10 minutes to figure out that I wasn't still watching Dracula because they're both in black and white, and it's just like boring white people talking to each other. So that's my Dracula origin story, I guess. So yeah, like I thought it was really important to learn a little bit about Bram Stoker before reading the book, and having learned a bit about him, it does kind of inform the book a lot. Mm-hmm. Even you, I know, who kind of read it without knowing a lot about him, just after learning some of it, kind of it recontextualized a lot of things for you, like after the fact.
Yeah.
So Abraham Stoker, who was called Bram, he was born in 1847 in Ireland, just a year after the Irish potato famine.
That's such a cool nickname for Abraham.
Right? You don't see that, really. But back to Bram Stoker. He was born, yeah, so he was born a year after the Irish potato famine. His father was a civil servant in the parliamentary section at Dublin Castle, which is the seat of the British government in Ireland. And later Bram went on to do that job as well, which makes sense when you read Dracula because it very much reads like it's written by like a law clerk.
Yeah.
It's very like over meticulous, and even like the vampire rules, which we'll get into in a bit, have like 9,000 like disclaimers, like he can't do this, but if he's over here, then he could do this like sometime. But if he's here, then you can like, so it's
no details were spared.
Yeah, it's like when you're listening to like a radio ad and they tell you like about the contest, and there's that guy that comes on at the end to like talk really fast and like say all the bullshit that's like, you know, makes the contest not worth entering. So Bram Stoker, in college, he excelled at sports, even though he was a sickly child. He was bedridden for several years, or at least 1 or 2 years, very briefly in his childhood. He did well at debating, and he started wanting to be an actor, but his family didn't consider that like a viable career option and pressured him to go into the civil servant job. So he had to kind of nurture his love of theater and things like that by taking unpaid drama critic work for things like the Dublin Evening Mail, which was a conservative newspaper that was unionist and anti-Catholic. If anyone here is trying to do something creative as a side hustle and has kind of like a draining day job, it's okay, because the man that wrote Dracula had to deal with that too.
Don't we all?
We all do. So, an interesting fact, Jack the Ripper happened 2 years before Bram Stoker started writing Dracula. He started writing it in 1890. Jack the Ripper happened in 1888.
So that was definitely
that was like fresh on his brain and stuff. And one of the things that we can talk about when we get into themes is that like part of the theme of Dracula kind of seems like anxiety about the city. We were kind of entering the Industrial Revolution. Things were changing. People were moving from kind of like farm communities into more cities. And just to show that people never change, even back then, like everyone thought that if you moved to the city, you were just gonna like fucking die and like get mugged and killed. And like Jack the Ripper happened. And part of why Dracula is so successful at killing people in the book is because he's in such a condensed city area. When he's in Transylvania, he doesn't really get many people because it's like 3 carriage rides and like a boat and all kinds of Oregon Trail-esque bullshit to like get up to his castle. And also all the villagers are very superstitious. So the fact that he exists in this metropolitan center for a big portion of the book is what allows him to be so good at what he does. So
is it like just his castle is like where no one goes?
I think it's just that his castle is just where no one goes. I mean, like, obviously there's other people in Transylvania, you know, and Jonathan Harker sees all the villagers on his way in, but, you know, they have to take, like, he takes, like, one carriage to, like, an inn, and then that carriage takes him to Dracula's spooky carriage, and then Dracula's spooky carriage takes him up to Dracula's castle, which sits on a fucking cliff surrounded on 3 sides by just, like, a solid drop into nothing.
And I'm sure it was, like, that must have been, like, an impossible feat to get to that castle, but it's probably like maybe only a couple miles away from where the villagers had to
like if this was like modern day, that's like it's like a 20-minute car trip, like could have solved all of that. That's a fun game to play when you're reading Dracula, just like reading it and just being like, at what point could just modern technology have solved all the problems in this book? Because a lot of like the anxiety and the tension in the plot comes from the fact that people are like sending communications to each other, and it takes like days for them to arrive. And if they have to go anywhere, it takes days for them to get there and days to get back. And everything just took a long fucking time in 1897 is the moral of Dracula that I kind of took away. But back to Bram Stoker, an interesting fact about him is that he was friends with Oscar Wilde and Oscar Wilde's parents through his civil work in Dublin, because when you pal around with politicians, sometimes you get to meet fun people, I guess.
Yeah, I've never heard about that until you told me last week.
Yeah, because they don't really seem like the kind of people that would hang out together. 'Cause, you know, you see like pictures of Oscar Wilde, and he's like this like bohemian, you know, quip machine, and, you know, always speaks in like the wittiest things. And if you look at a picture of Bram Stoker, he looks like one of the presidents that you don't remember. And he just kind of looks like a stuffy, boring man, kind of. And everything we've told you about him so far, it seems like he would be, like he was a clerk and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, but they were friends. And another weird kind of connection of them is that they both briefly competed for the same woman.
Right.
Florence, I can't remember what her last name was, but it went on to be Stoker because she eventually decided to go with Bram Stoker. And I can't imagine, like, Bram Stoker must be just like, well, I was about to say Bram Stoker must be great in bed to win over Oscar Wilde, but as we kind of know about the Stoker marriage, it was mainly kind of loveless.
Yeah.
They didn't really...
It sounds like they didn't...
They kind of lived their own separate lives in the same house, kind of.
Yeah.
Because Bram Stoker, as I'll get into in a second, he got a job at a big theater, so he was kind of gone all the time dealing with managing the theater and balancing books and stuff like that, and she was just kind of happy to be with her friends and the interesting people that kind of Bram Stoker brought her into contact with through his position. So it's been called by Stoker's own like descendants, I think, like a marriage of convenience.
Yeah, I mean, it's like today where they kind of shack celebrities up with each other just for publicity reasons. I'm sure it's very similar.
Oh yeah, and there are some other reasons why their marriage was loveless that we'll talk about in a second.
Yeah.
But just talking about that, like if people are always looking to make like good historical dramas and things like that, where's a movie where Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker have to compete for the attention of a woman while Bram Stoker's like that writes itself.
Yeah, that's a comedy script. Just that's comedy gold.
Like Stoker and Wilde in love or something, while Bram Stoker works at a theater for a man that's basically Dracula. Which we can talk about that now because Bram Stoker was prone to hero worship a lot in his life. He was like he would get like obsessed with people. Like he was very much a fan of Walt Whitman, who wrote these poems called the Calamus poems that were described by the Barnes and Noble edition of Dracula that I read with the biography in them as basically homosexual manifestos. Yeah, and Walt Whitman kind of came from like the Henry David Thoreau kind of mindset, like very naturey, but his work in particular was about like the bonds between like men and like men showing like affection to each other, and Bram Stoker really took to that. But his most important thing of hero worship was for Henry Irving, who was a big actor back then. He was like the stage A-lister. It was like he was like the Matthew McConaughey of like the late 1800s kind of the theater.
Kind of looked like Matthew McConaughey too. I just pulled up his picture.
You pulled up a picture of him? I haven't actually seen a picture of him. I need to.
Well, it's a drawing, but yeah, interesting haircut.
But yeah, Bram Stoker first saw him on stage in 1867 in a play called The Rivals when Henry was 29, and he was like at his peak. He was like the biggest star of the day. And Stoker was like so into him that like later on in his life he wrote a whole book called Personal Reminiscences of Henry Irving Volume 1.
Wow.
Which the Barnes and Noble edition didn't go into too much detail about that. Like it kind of just mentioned it briefly like in like parentheses for like a quote of Bram Stoker's, but I imagine if there was a Volume 1 there had to be more volumes, right? So like this guy was just like fucking in love with Henry Irving. And
unless he just wanted to make it seem like that's actually kind of like a hilarious like intentional joke. I was going to call this one Volume 1.
So Bram Stoker was really into Henry Irving, and he wrote that book way later after they became friends, because once Bram Stoker was established as a drama critic, Stoker would go out of his way to defend Irving against criticism. Like people would write bad things about him, and Bram Stoker would go out of his way to like write really positive reviews to kind of like attack people who gave negative reviews. So he kind of caught Henry Irving's attention that way, and Henry Irving invited him to dinner to thank him. It was kind of just like a thanks for being like for being like a fan of mine, and but like Bram Stoker took it as the beginning of like a magnificent friendship.
Oh wow.
So Irving in 1878 he purchased the Lyceum Theater. He purchased his own theater, and he offered Stoker the job of acting manager, and Stoker accepted right away, and he quit his clerk job immediately, and he only took a short vacation to marry Florence, and he went straight from that right into managing that. Yeah, he worked for like Henry Irving like his whole life, and basically like when Henry Irving passed away, like Stoker's life like lost all meaning because Henry Irving kind of treated him like shit and like just dumped all his work on him all the time. Stoker slaved at the theater for Irving. He was in charge of the business side of everything.
Yeah.
But though his job was demanding, he pursued other interests. But though his job at the theater was demanding, he did pursue other interests, including writing. He would eventually publish 14 novels, including Dracula and a short story collection. which again is encouragement for people doing creative stuff, because this motherfucker wrote 14 books. Can you name any of them?
No.
But you just need that one, and a lot of the books he wrote were like, he was very kind of, he only sort of got like known for Dracula, like in Death, and sort of the popularity that Dracula got with the film adaptations and the plays and things. At the time, he was known a lot. He would go to colleges and he would give speeches about like politics. He wrote like the first book he wrote was something about like on the meditations of being a law clerk or something like that. Like real boring shit.
And now Dracula now, I know Dracula now is public domain, so like anyone can just make their own adaptation of Dracula.
Yeah.
Should they want to. What is that? Is that just because it's the book at this point is over 100 years old?
I think so, yeah, because that's part of why, which we'll get into our next episode about Nosferatu. There's a lot of issues that came up with copyright involving that, and why it had to be Nosferatu.
He
and
was gone by that point, though, right?
He was gone by that point. His wife was still alive, though, and the estate, more importantly. Stoker began legal studies at the age of 39. He was called to the bar in 1890, so he became a lawyer later in life. I have that in my notes. And this is kind of an interesting note that once he was called to the bar, Florence finally found his profession admirable and only ever referred to her husband as a barrister from then on. Wow. Like, she never referred to him as like an actor or a theater manager, even though she herself, I think when she was younger, had aspirations to be an actress. But like as she got older, she kind of got more like ashamed, I guess, of his being involved in the theater and trying to do creative stuff. Like, she didn't view that as like a real profession.
She's probably just pissed that he was like never having sex with her.
That very well could be. I mean,
hanging out with Henry Irving and Oscar Wilde every night. Yeah, it's
kind of interesting when you think of like Henry Irving and Bram Stoker. They almost kind of have like a Dracula Renfield-esque relationship when you look at them, where he's like almost kind of like this lowly servant, and his master treats him like shit, but he kind of has this like undying devotion to him still for some reason.
Yeah, I'm sure that influenced some level of that character. Yeah,
and there's no solid evidence of this, but I think a lot of people basically admit now that Dracula was written to later become a play. And that Bram Stoker heavily based Dracula on Henry Irving because he really wanted him to play Dracula in an adaptation of it. Yeah. Because after the release, Stoker actually held a dramatic reading of the novel at the Lyceum to protect the copyright and interest, which I have to imagine was a very boring show to sit through. Just people reading this long-ass book for many hours. But afterwards, like Bram Stoker asked him, like Henry Irving, what he thought of the book, and Henry Irving, all he said was dreadful.
Holy shit!
One word.
That must have destroyed.
And like talks of trying to do like a theater thing with it, like never went any further because he was kind of just like doing he was doing the reading there to protect the copyright, but he was also kind of testing the waters to see if like Henry Irving might be interested, and just shut it down right away.
He's like, I got a pitch for you.
And Henry Irving was like, no. And that was the end of it. And like maybe he thought the role was too small because, as we'll talk about here in a bit, Dracula doesn't really show up a lot in Dracula, like at all. Yeah. He's in like less than a sixth of the book, I think. Like his effect is felt throughout the entire novel, but he's more of just kind of like this force that's like there in the air.
Which is kind of cool. It's almost like a Jaws type thing. Even though Dracula shows up within like the first chapter or two.
Yeah. But he shows up in the first chapter to let you know he means business, and then the rest of the novel's basically just this like growing dread of people slowly turning into vampires, and like everyone's plans to try to stop that just going awry, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, Stoker's life lost all purpose after Irving's death, and after a series of strokes, he died himself in 1912. He never made much money from his writing in his life, but his last book in 1911, The Lair of the White Worm, did well for the time. And yeah, like an interesting note about Dracula is that like it was popular at the time, but it wasn't like a phenomenon.
Yeah.
Like it kind of came out at like the same time as a lot of other sort of like psychological, like horror science kind of combination,
like Invisible Man
books, like H.G. Wells's work for sure, like The Time Machine, Invisible Man, Picture of Dorian Gray, speaking of Oscar Wilde, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And interestingly, a lot of those have been this is around the time that Sigmund Freud was kind of coming big and into vogue.
Yeah.
So like a lot of these kind of almost have like Freudian ideas in them. Like Dracula kind of has like, the Freudian, there's like the dual like subconscious kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's also there in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And so like all these like dual kind of properties of man sort of books, because Bram Stoker lived at a time when like the world was changing a lot and things were kind of going from being more where like religion was at the center of everyone's life to, like science and, career stuff was sort of becoming more of the center of people's world. Because, Charles Darwin was happening during Bram Stoker's life and kind of changing what everyone thought they knew about
religion,
where life happened and how religion worked. Like the Civil War happened, or there was like a lot of stuff that happened during his life, a lot of transitions in how society functioned. And that sort of conflict between old ways of living and new ways of living, like we just talked about a bit ago with the city anxiety, is a big kind of central conflict in the book of Dracula. But yeah, Dracula wasn't like a huge hit at the time. Like it was like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a fan of it. I know, but
it's a sleeper hit.
It did okay, but yeah, it was kind of just viewed as like it was just another book out at the time. It would be like if we went like 200 years in the future and like The Hunger Games was like just a phenomenon that like everyone, like every child knew who Katniss Everdeen was,
right.
And
to us we'd just be like, what?
To us we'd be like it's like The Hunger Games are fine. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, Katniss can get it, but it's like that's what we went with as a culture. Okay, and I feel like that's what a lot of people in the 1800s would be like if they knew just how like crazy popular Dracula became.
Yeah, it's gotta be mind blowing.
Let's briefly talk about what does Dracula look like in this, because Dracula, again, when I was saying earlier that everyone has a visual version of Dracula in their head, it's probably, regardless of where you're from culturally, England, America, wherever, it's probably some kind of a posh man and some kind of a posh get up with a cape.
Yeah.
But that's not what Dracula looks like at all in the book.
Yeah, no, you usually picture, like, there's, like, definitely, like, they've tried to make Dracula sexy over the years.
For sure.
Especially in Dracula 2000. But yeah, in the book, he's described as, like, this, like, kind of frail, like, lumpy, like, just creepy dude, right?
Yeah, it's clear from, like, the very get-go that this is a creepy motherfucker, and he's not to be trusted.
And I think they say all he has is a mustache, crazy long white mustache.
He has a long white mustache. He has a unibrow, and like no hair on the top of his head. Like, is that like male pattern baldness? Are they implying? But he has like long white hair, right? Yeah. So he's got like the Devin Townsend, like the skullet kind of look.
Yeah.
The Crypt Keeper, where it's like bald on top, but you got like the wispies on the side.
It's a great look.
And he's got red eyes. Mm-hmm. He's got sharp teeth, which it just says sharp teeth in general.
Sharp teeth, yeah.
They do in particular point out his canine teeth in particular, but it does just say that all of his teeth are sharp.
Yeah.
So it's not that he just has fangs. He has like just choppers
just
that he
a bunch
can.
Of choppers, yeah. And I remember the book that my brother had a copy of Dracula when we were kids, and the cover had this really cool drawing of him that looked very much like how they describe. And I remember just seeing like a row of sharp teeth and the long white hair and everything.
Yeah, the way he's described in the book, like it's kind of amazing that like a book, like I thought like reading like this book from 1897 wouldn't like translate well, or that it would be kind of hokey. But like when Dracula's described, it is like creepy and sort of like it's his mouth is described as being like red, as if always like covered in blood, and his eyes are red, and I think he's got long fingernails. He's described as having hair on his palms, I know.
Yeah.
Which I guess means that Dracula masturbates a lot. But I mean, he's got a lot of time, I guess, to kill. But he also has long fingernails, I think.
You know, as a reader, you're reading it and you're feeling that sense of dread, but it's also like what the characters are feeling themselves too. So it's like a very
Yeah.
Kind of like a never-ending story type thing.
And because it's almost written in like this first person narrative, you can almost put yourself there and like you kind of like visualize like what would I do if I was in this situation, you know? Like the book begins with Jonathan Harker going to sell Count Dracula some property in London, and he goes all the way to Transylvania, and like I said, he has to take like 3 carriage rides.
Yeah.
And he gets up in this castle where he meets Dracula, who's just like the creepiest motherfucker ever. And is like nice to him, but it's like got like this underhanded like menace to him, where like he's like everyone, like I'm sure like our listeners have had like someone talk to them where like the words coming out of their mouth are like nice, but you can just see in their eyes and their expression and everything that like they just want you to die. Yeah. And that's basically just like how Dracula communicates to Harker all the time. He's like, yes, you'll be staying with me for a month, but like the subtext and look in his eyes that like you're my slave, like I've kidnapped you. And then Jonathan Harker goes to like try all the doors after Dracula fucks off to like go hunt or sleep or something, and he finds himself trapped. And so that allows you to put yourself in the character too, because you're going like, because it becomes very cat and mouse for a while, where like Jonathan Harker tries to do this to escape from the castle, and Dracula counters him by doing this, and he tries to do this, and even though Jonathan Harker's kind of just a dumbass in general, you can kind of put yourself there and kind of picture like, what would I do if I was doing this? And and that's an interesting thing about the structure of the book. But veering a little off track, a little.
Yeah, well, his power. So let's get back to his powers.
Yeah. So we've talked about what he looks like. Let's talk a bit about his powers. So
shape-shifting's a big one.
He can shapeshift. What can he shapeshift into?
Well, he shapeshifts into a wolf.
He can be a wolf.
A bat.
He could be a bat.
Fog, mist.
He can turn into fog and mist.
A large dog.
He does become a dog at one point.
Plus, I mean, he's basically at the very beginning, he's tricking Harker into thinking that he has like servants and a driver and everything, and it's just Dracula.
Yeah, that's like a thing is, yeah, so like we were saying, like Jonathan Harker goes up to the castle and he takes one cart to like an inn where he gets there, and everyone has where that famous kind of like superstitious scene happens where Jonathan Harker is going to Dracula's castle and everyone's like, no, don't go, and they like give him like a crucifix and stuff. And then like the next morning he leaves and he goes up to Borgo Pass, which no one wants to take him to because that's where Count Dracula comes, and everyone's very superstitious, doesn't want to be out after the sun's down.
Yeah.
And once they get to the Borgo Pass, it's night, and like they get there, and the driver of the coach is like, "Well, no one's here. I guess we should try again tomorrow." And he goes to like turn back, and right as he says that, this carriage pulls up, driven by a man, and it's later revealed that it's Dracula who's driving it. He's in a disguise to like look like a carriage driver, but he has to do everything. Yeah, he's out there driving Jonathan Harker to and from the castle. Once he gets into the castle, he's like setting his food and everything, and which is made.
To be fair, probably, like, you know, the guy's got to be bored, so maybe there's just this way to pass time. He's like, no, I'll go pick him up.
Well, like, when you start reading it, like, you kind of think that, like, Dracula's just in there by himself, but then you learn later that there's 3 lady vampires there. Why aren't they helping? What are they doing all day? Make one of them go drive the spooky carriage. Or they just, like, I just want to see, like, the scene, like, before that where he's like, someone needs to go pick up Mr. Harker from the pass, and they're all just like filing their nails, and like one's just like on her cell phone. He's just like fine, I'll do it, and he just like storms out of the room.
Gotta do everything around.
Just, like, get no help.
All right, whose turn is it to clean the bathroom?
Who didn't change the toilet paper?
But that's really the 3 females. Those are the only characters that are actually described as being in the castle.
Those are the only ones that are described as actually being there, even to the point where I think when Jonathan Harker like gets off the carriage, like he goes to the front of the carriage and like Dracula's already gone. He's already like misted into the castle to start doing stuff. And that's an interesting power kind of segueing of Dracula in this, is that they really go into detail about how he can just like apparate into and out of things. It feels like in a lot of later versions of Dracula, like he can become a bat, and in a couple of them he can also become a wolf. But he is just like a physical being. And in this, like it's even more terrifying because you can't even keep your doors shut against him or anything locked. If there's like an inch of space to get through, he's gonna miss through, and that's
as long as he's invited.
As long as he's invited, yes. Yeah. That is a good point. Good catch. Yeah, sir. And also, good catch.
Also, just I mean, they describe it a lot. He has like telepathic abilities. Like he's able to like control people.
Yeah.
from like pretty much anywhere, right?
And he controls them in like a weird way. Like it's like I know later in the novel, Mina starts getting bit. She starts becoming a vampire, and he does something on her called the vampire's baptism of blood. I believe Van Helsing calls it. And that's basically where Dracula cuts his chest open and makes him bleed, and then he shoves Mina's head on it and makes her drink of it. And the way it's described, it seems like he's making her go down on him.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of Bram Stoker's intention when he wrote it, because Dracula is a very sexual book. It's not sexual in the way that like Dracula's sexy, like in a lot of adaptations, but sex is kind of...
You mean like in Dracula 2000?
Oh, he's so sexy in that. Just Gerard Butler with his long Scott Stapp hair and his open blazer and no shirt.
Which, by the way, it was halfway through that movie before I realized it was Gerard Butler.
Yeah, he doesn't look like him.
It's pre 300 Gerard
Yeah,
Butler.
he's not
Different
juiced
guy.
yet. Back to I just totally lost my train of thought. Dracula powers.
Yeah, so the powers, there's a lot, and there's as you said earlier, there's a lot of different rules about how he can leave Transylvania. He's got to be surrounded by Transylvanian soil.
Yeah, so Dracula's weaknesses, he can't, like his weaknesses in the book are a little bit different than what we think of for vampires in general, because when you think of Dracula in general, you think like he can't be out in the sunlight. In the sunlight, he'll die. He has to be, in his coffin before daybreak. And in this, Dracula is out in the day a couple times, but I think it's just that I think Van Helsing says that he can only transform at dusk, at dawn, and at noon for some reason. So at 3 times a day, he has powers, essentially.
Which are really just completely arbitrary times.
They're really, yeah. Like, is that taking into account, like, time zones? Like, if it's noon, like, noon's, like, I guess...
That stuff always bothers me.
I guess the implication is that just, like, it's when the sun's, like, right about to go down, the sun's right about to come up, and when the sun's, like, right, like, directly overhead. Okay. I think
that makes sense, yeah. But when it's, like, with gremlins, where it's, like, don't feed them after midnight.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, what midnight where? And... then when can you feed them?
Also, the gremlins run around in the snow a lot. Isn't that water? Why aren't they all just like...
Oh my god, you're right. Wow.
We've found plot holes in gremlins in our Dracula podcast.
He's also got to constantly drink blood, right? Is that a weakness?
He has to constantly... Yeah, he has to constantly drink blood. And his sleeping during the day, I think in this is more just like he sleeps during the day because he has to feed and he's just like digesting. Because at one point when Jonathan Harker is in the castle, he tries to kill Dracula and he finally finds where he's located in this labyrinth and he opens Dracula's box and Dracula's in there sleeping. But in the book, the vampires don't sleep, like they do in movies with their hands across their chest and they're asleep. He's just like laying there in this box of dirt with like his eyes open and just like this like kind of like vacant stare, which is terrifying. And it's described as like an angry vacant stare. And he's just like gorged he's like described as like a tick almost. Like his skin is like just like bulging about ready to burst. His hair's a little bit darker. Like his eyes look bloated and his mouth is just like covered in blood.
Which I have to say, in the Nosferatu, the first adaptation, they really nail that.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
that scene where Jonathan Harker finds him sleeping in his coffin, and it's really well done.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like it's so, but I think just him sleeping during the day is more just like he has powers at night. So he can only transform at dusk and dawn, but I think during night as well, like all through the night, he has powers as well. So I think it's more just like that during the day he doesn't have powers, so that's just when he chooses to sleep. Yeah, which makes sense. I mean, if I only had powers like half the day, I would also just sleep during the half when I didn't have powers. Yeah. But yeah, there's a handful of times when Dracula comes out, like during the day. Like there's a scene when Jonathan Harker's shaving during the day, because Dracula, once he's kidnapped Jonathan Harker, kind of just leaves Jonathan Harker to do whatever during the day because he's asleep. Right. And in a lot of cases during the night as well, because he goes off and hunts and he brings back babies to eat because Dracula eats several babies in this book. Lots of baby murder in Dracula. So Jonathan Harker's left to his own devices a lot of the day, and at one point during the day he's shaving, he has a tiny handheld mirror, and Dracula just like pops up and it's in the middle of the day. And and chucks the mirror out the window. And it startles Jonathan Harker when he comes in the room because he's shaving in the mirror and he can see the door behind him.
Yeah.
And Dracula like sneaks up on him because he doesn't have a reflection, which is another weakness of vampires.
You think that's a weakness? I think that's a power.
I think it's a little bit. Well, it's a weakness in that like if anyone sees that, they know automatically you're a vampire.
That's true.
That's like in every movie about vampires, like in Fright Night and stuff like that. Everyone's like, "Oh, bullshit, that guy's a vampire." But the second they like see a mirror and he doesn't have a reflection, they're like, "Holy shit, that's a vampire."
Yeah. It's pretty creepy.
And also, you have no way of knowing what the fuck you look like, which is also part of why I don't buy the sexy Dracula. How does he look that good when he can't see what he looks like? Like, of course he looks like a weirdo with a unibrow and a mustache if he can't look at what he looks like, because there's no mirrors in Dracula's castle at all in the book.
Yeah,
and which is why Jonathan Harker has to use his tiny one to shave.
Dude's probably got all sorts of weird sores on his face and shit. Things stuck in his teeth.
And that's also partly why, like at one point, Jonathan Harker, when he discovers Dracula in his box, like I was saying a second ago, he tries to kill him by hitting him in the head with a shovel, and it doesn't quite work. And Dracula wakes up right as he hits him and scares Jonathan Harker and makes him run away. But he does manage to ding him in the head. And for the rest of the book, Dracula just has like a shovel ding on his head. like he's a character in Home Alone or something. Which wisely the adaptations choose not to borrow from the book, because they would just look silly if Dracula had just like a big bruise on his head the whole time.
It's like the brand name of the shovel backwards.
It's got like hefty written in backwards letters across his forehead. What are some other weaknesses? Oh yeah, he doesn't like religious symbolism, crucifixes he doesn't like. And in this book that you don't see in adaptations, at least in my experience, he doesn't like communion wafers. Communion wafers are used a lot to keep him at bay. Like Van Helsing tucks communion wafers in like the door jambs of tombs and windows to keep him from going through. They later get rid of all of Dracula's boxes by putting a communion wafer in each of them, so he can't get in any of them. And speaking of his boxes, another weakness of his is that he has to sleep in a box, which isn't explicitly called a coffin in any way.
Never. Yeah.
It's just a big box. And
they do call it a coffin in Nosferatu.
They do call it a coffin in Nosferatu, and it does look a little bit more coffin-like.
It's more like a coffin, yeah.
But in this, it's just he has a box, and it has to be full of his native earth, and he has to return to it to be able to recharge and re-energize. And if he can't return, he'll die.
Do they describe what kind of box is it? Is it just like a?
I think it's just like a plywood box. I guess
it's like a big Amazon box.
I just picture in my head just like a big shipping crate, kind of just a big wide
but like nailed shut.
Like nailed shut, like something that would be in like the Raiders of the Lost Ark warehouse or something, you know.
Yeah.
And he sleeps in these boxes. And in the book Dracula, not only does he have a box instead of a coffin, he doesn't have one box. He has 50. And he traps Jonathan Harker in the castle at the beginning, and then he gets all 50 of his boxes together, and he goes off to England, and Jonathan Harker sees all this happening, and eventually escapes from Dracula's castle after almost being attacked by lady vampires.
Yeah.
And he eventually just at one point goes, fuck it, I'm going to try to just scale the wall, because he can't just like jump out the window, because like I said, it's surrounded on three sides by like a drop, but he does scale the window to get into Dracula's room at one point. So he eventually just goes, fuck it, I'm just going to scale the wall. They're eventually going to kill me. He hears Dracula and his bride's talking about how like soon when I leave, you can just have Harker to yourself. So he gets gone. And so that's how Jonathan Harker knows that Dracula's going somewhere. But Dracula takes all of his boxes and he goes to London, and he starts buying various properties, and he kind of scatters them all over the place. So he has a base everywhere, because he has to return to his box to be able to recharge.
Right.
And I don't think it's
a plan.
Like I don't think it's explicitly like the sunlight will kill him like in other things, because again he's out in the daylight, but it's just he just has to be in that box to rest, or else he'll just die, I guess.
Yeah.
And Dracula's 50 boxes, and Dracula's 50 boxes becomes a big part of the later story, because Dracula, once he gets his 50 boxes, he gets on the ship the Demeter, which is a big part of, which is in most adaptations, him taking the Demeter.
I guess depending on the budget of the adaptation.
Depending on the budget. But it feels pretty common in a lot of them, though. You have the part where the ship shows up, and you have the ship captain with his arms tied to the wheel. I've seen that in at least 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
And that gets into a little bit more detail in the book, where, like I said, the beginning of like it feels like you could almost make several movies out of Dracula, because like the beginning, like I said, is a very like cat and mouse game between Jonathan Harker and Count Dracula.
Yeah.
And then once he gets onto the boat, it becomes like a Jason movie for a minute, where the crew's getting picked off one by one until eventually there's no one left to drive the boat except for the captain.
Yeah, it's Jason Takes Manhattan.
Jason Takes Whitby, or wherever they're going to in London. And yeah, the whole thing is told in this log, because we forgot to mention this. The narrative of Dracula isn't a traditional narrative. It's not like Jonathan Harker went to so-and-so and then so-and-so happened. It's a collection of documents put together that form one narrative. So the beginning of the story is the Jonathan Harker part is all Jonathan Harker's diary, and it's all written in first person.
Which is, it's a really cool way to read a book. It's found footage.
It's like a found footage movie, but as a book, yeah. And it gets a little unbelievable at times, like found footage movies where like this crazy shit's happening to him. You're like, why are you still writing this down? Like, and at certain points, it seems like he's writing like as things are happening to him. So like, I'm imagining him running away from like lady vampires while he's like scribbling madly in like a journal, like like not even looking at what he's writing while he's just like madly.
You won't believe what's chasing me down this hallway right now.
My dearest Mina, I'm running for my life currently, and I can't. But then once you get to the ship part, it's all told like a ship's log, and it becomes like a completely different document. It feels like you're looking at like a police case almost, and like these are like the facts.
And it's like newspaper articles.
And there's newspaper articles and things like that.
Well, it's supposed to be like you're reading the book that's compiled by Mina, right?
Yeah, which happens later. Yeah, Mina eventually to fight Count Dracula at the end, she compiles everyone's diaries together to create one consistent narrative. And then the book gets very Charlie Kaufman for a minute, as all the characters in Dracula read the entire book that you've just read up to the point that you've read. So now everyone has all the same information you do. So the entire crew's dead, and Dracula kind of like masters a storm to push them into dock, where he then bounces off the ship as a dog and kind of runs off into the woods.
Yeah.
And all of his boxes are there, and they get kind of taken from there to all of his various properties. But once he gets to Whitby, ironically, Jonathan Harker's fiancée, Mina, happens to be vacationing right where Dracula's boat shows up.
So convenient. With
her best friend Lucy, who they've known for a while. And at this point, the novel shifts from talking in Jonathan Harker's perspective and talking the boat's perspective, and it becomes about Lucy and Mina for a while, where they're kind of talking back and forth. You learn a little bit about Lucy's life, how she's kind of seeing three men, or being suited by being courted by three different men. Dr. Seward, who runs the sanitarium, which is adjacent to the property that Dracula purchases, Carfax Abbey. She's being courted by Arthur Holmwood, who's like the son of a lord. He's kind of from old money. Quincy. And she's also being courted by Quincy Morris, who's just like a yippee-ki-yay cowboy character. And you know, Mina talks about how she's nervous about Jonathan because Jonathan hasn't come home from doing Dracula stuff yet.
Right.
And Dracula's kind of like manipulated the situation with Jonathan so much that he had like fake letters written out. He made Jonathan write fake letters, have them sent out to where it looks like he's more okay than he actually is.
Right.
But then eventually it gets to the point where he's just been gone for a while, because once Jonathan escapes from the castle, you don't know what happens to him. He's just scaling a wall, and then his part of the narrative ends.
It's
so
gone,
he's alive or dead. You don't know as a reader at that point.
Yeah.
So she's worried. She's talking to Lucy about that. Lucy's talking about her life. They go on vacation to Whitby together as Dracula's boat comes in.
Can you imagine going on vacation where you have no idea where your husband is?
Oh, yeah. Like, how can you even enjoy your, like, what? I guess maybe that's why they went on vacation, to try to, like, take her mind off of it, maybe.
But then, like, how would anyone get in touch with her if he did die or something?
Well, it was like the 1800s, so, like, nobody could get in touch with anybody, as I've learned from this book.
Like, just get a letter 2 months later.
But, yeah, and at this point, Lucy starts sleepwalking, and, you know.
So Dracula's stalking her, controlling,
and she starts like getting her blood sucked out and starts, you know, becoming anemic, and no one can figure out what's wrong with her. And it's Dracula that's, you know, like draining her blood, but none of the characters know this.
Yeah.
And at this point in the book, you haven't been told that anyone's a vampire yet, just that Dracula's just a weird motherfucker, and that there are these weird ladies that come in, and he's got kind of an attraction to blood, and he doesn't show his reflection, but But other than that, like, you kind of don't find out it's vampires till way later. Dr. Seward brings in his friend Dr. Van Helsing to try to figure out what's going on with Lucy. He starts introducing all these weird sort of things, like he starts putting garlic up around her room, which everyone's like, well, what are you doing? Why are you putting garlic around her room? He's like, just trust me. Like, he won't explain what he's doing to anyone.
So did they mention in the book that Van Helsing's had experience with vampires before? Or is this kind of just like...
They mention that he has several degrees. I don't know if they specifically say that he's dealt with like I don't think it's like how some people
vampires.
like have, you know, like Van Helsing is like from like a long line. He's like meant to slay the vampire, all this kind of like action hero-ness. He's just kind of just a doctor that knows a lot in this.
Yeah.
But yeah, he starts putting up garlic around everywhere, which garlic has kind of a large superstitious history. Like, it's, you know, like it was garlic and onions were invoked as deities by the Egyptians when they took oaths. They had uses, like Roman soldiers ate garlic to inspire them and give them courage. Like, it kind of just has like a weird superstitious history.
Yeah.
And it kind of turned into like a vampire thing too. But he starts putting garlic all around her room, you know, and they just can't figure out why she's dying. She eventually dies. She comes back to life as a vampire. She's buried in Whitby.
Yeah.
And comes back to life as a vampire and starts hunting children as this thing called the Bloofer Lady,
yeah.
which is a great name. Great band name.
Yeah, Bloofer Lady.
Just all one word. Because, yeah, like it becomes like a newspaper article for a second to tell you about this Bloofer Lady that showed up in Whitby. Because when she's sick, they do at one point take her back to London where she's staying with Dr. Seward in his sanitarium. Along with a bunch of other crazy people, because Dr. Seward is he runs a mental asylum. He lives there. So like Renfield is also there. Yeah. Which a lot of the early parts of Dr. Seward's diary, like before it gets into him trying to solve Lucy's things, are sort of his notes of Renfield and how he's kind of just sort of trying to mask the fact that Lucy didn't decide to marry him because, like I said, she's being suited by these three guys and she does choose to marry Arthur Holmwood. So Dr. Seward's bummed, so he's kind of focused on Renfield.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's in there and Lucy's in there as well. But when she dies, they take her and bury her back in Whitby because she really loved being there, and that's where she comes back to life and becomes the Bloofer Lady.
Yeah.
And at this point, Dr. Van Helsing tells all three men that they have to go and kill her.
Kill her, yeah.
So yeah, they go, they kill her, and then after that, the rest of the book is them just going around and finding Dracula's 50 boxes and putting a communion wafer in each of them. And then also halfway through, Dracula starts, like I said, he does the thing to Mina where he makes her drink from blood in his chest, and it's described like fellatio almost, where he's like forcing her head down, and she says like, he forced my head down, I had no choice but to breathe or to drink the, oh my God. It's exactly like that. Like I had to drink, like you have to imagine that wasn't done on accident. But and then at the end they eventually put wafers in all of Dracula's boxes. They find his last box with him in it being taken back to his castle because he eventually just like fucks off from London. He knows he's been done for, so he goes back to where he's from. But Mina's still cursed, which in this, like, when vampires start biting people in this book, they don't become vampires right away. Yeah. They just lose blood, and then once they finally die, then they become vampires. But if you've just been bit and you're still alive, then you're just kind of under their mind control, I think.
That makes sense.
So they have to go actually kill Dracula so Mina can go back to normal.
And after they kill Dracula, she just that's it? She's fine?
Yeah, she just goes back to normal. Though oddly, the ending of this is kind of a different, because the Dracula endings, typically they go back to Dracula's castle, they open the box, they find him, they stake him. Yeah. In this, they catch him on the road to Dracula's castle, like he's being pulled in the snow by like a sled with like all these like, Romani people or like people from that region. Yeah. And kind of the whole group of people attacks this group of people on the sled, and they pull the top off the box and just kill him right there in the middle of, the thing.
And that's it. He's dead.
And he's dead. And then that's, how the book ends. And then you find out later that, Mina had a baby and she went back to normal, and they named the baby after all the men in the company that got rid of Dracula. Yeah. And that's more or less just the whole story of Dracula.
You said when the book came out, it didn't make him a ton of money. It wasn't even.
No, not really. I think he had to like right before he died, even he like applied to get like a grant of some kind to keep it. So yeah, like when you're trying to do stuff like that, yeah, you're not like
Yeah, it's just sad. Guy never knew.
Yeah,
what
it's
an iconic figure he created.
He did kind of have a sad life, yeah, for being like someone who was kind of a closeted, possibly self-loathing homosexual in a loveless marriage in a kind of bad work environment for most of his life, and wrote one book that changed the world and didn't even get to live to see the effects of it, more or less.
Yeah.
Like, you deserve better, Bram. I hope wherever you are, you're partying it up. I don't know where I was going with that.
Yeah. So 1912, he passes away. The first adaptation of Dracula was the unauthorized Nosferatu
Yes.
German film, silent film.
Yes.
That was before. Was that before talkies?
This is before talkies. Yes.
Yeah. So.
So yeah, it's a silent movie. There's actually one more adaptation that's lost that happened right before Nosferatu, but no one's ever seen it. But we'll talk about more of that in our second episode, because that's this episode was about the book. We got through all that, I think. And in our next episode, we're going to go into detail about F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, the 1922 silent film adaptation, and we'll talk about the influences of that. And
And if you wanted to watch that, it's available anywhere.
Yeah, it's public. It's public domain. So yeah, if you wanna catch up with us before the next podcast episode, it's available literally everywhere. And it doesn't take that long to watch. It's like an hour, 12 minutes.
Hour and 12, something like that. Yeah. The version on Amazon Prime, the music that goes along to it isn't very good. I don't know if you can find a better version on YouTube. But maybe steer clear of that one. It's clearly the music's not synced up with the action at all.
Yeah. But that's all we'll talk about from Nosferatu in this episode. Just give you a recommendation of don't watch the shitty one with the weird music.
There's got to be one on YouTube that has good music.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah, if you look around long enough.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I guess on that note, is that a good place to wrap up for our first episode?
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Yeah, this was a fun time describing the book Dracula by Bram Stoker, and be sure to join us next time for our in-depth discussion of Nosferatu. Thank you, and this has been Hacks on Drac. Have a good evening.
Thank you for listening to the premiere episode of Hacks on Drac with Matt Reiser and Chris Gersbeck. The entire 10-episode series will be available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and everywhere else on Friday, July 26th. For now, please like our Facebook page for updates.